All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Jake Sherman. For those of you who don't know me, I'm professor and chair of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And it's a really great privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the second of the Theōros events we're doing throughout this year. We're trying to, the lecture series and event series that we're doing this year is really focused on renewing the humanities in the broadest sense, and especially renewing the contemplative humanities, the humanities that are in dialogue with and vehicles for, to carry a tradition that's more than just a tradition of scholarship and learning, the acquisition of a knowledge base and skill set, but also about the transformation of human capacities, about the exploration of the nature of consciousness itself, and about not just interpretation, but also knowledge of the world. So as part of that, we're really excited to welcome two extraordinary speakers, Evan Thompson and Matthew David Siegel. Matt is one of my colleagues here in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, where he's a transdisciplinary researcher, a writer, a teacher, and a philosopher, applying process relational thought across the natural and social sciences, as well as to the study of consciousness. He's an associate professor in the PCC program, and Matt's going to be in dialogue with Evan Thompson, who we're really fortunate to have join us all the way from the University of British Columbia, where he's professor of philosophy. You probably know some of his works. His most recent one is here. Matt's got a copy of it, The Blind Spot, co-authored with Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser, What Science Cannot Ignore, or Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience. It's fantastic. If you haven't read it yet, don't walk to your local bookshop and get a copy of it. You may also know Evan from his works, Waking, Dreaming, Being, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation, and Philosophy, or Mind and Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind. For my part, I first came across his work when I read the classic, The Embodied Mind, which he co-authored with Eleanor Roche and Francisco Varela. So thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you were able to grab some refreshments and something to drink ahead of time. And would you please now join me in welcoming Matt and Evan.
Thank you, Jake, and to the whole Theōros team, which is Jake and Adam Robert, for organizing this. And I think we're going to have a really special night. I'm really grateful to you, Evan, for coming out to CIIS to talk about this new book. If I can just say, not to embarrass you, but The Embodied Mind really did, when I read that as an undergraduate, set me on a course to continue studying philosophy, not just as a career path, but as a way of life. It was a really important influence on me early on, and so thank you for that as well. So this book came out earlier this year, and I read it as soon as I could get my hands on a copy. To set this up, I think let's put this in world historical context. Natural science is the most powerful method of knowledge production and its technological applications that human beings have ever come across. It has transformed the entire planet. It has transformed the very nature of life and our humanity. This book is addressed right at the core of this transformation that has been brought about by science. But nowadays, in the more immediate present, it seems that science is threatened. And it seems threatened from on multiple fronts, both internal to scientific institutions and external. We can't agree on scientific facts, nor can we agree on common sense facts. And so I think a shallow, superficial interpretation of this book might be that it is a kind of attack on science or scientific culture, but a deeper reading, or just a more adequate reading, would show that I think you're actually trying to defend science and scientific practice from a type of hubris that actually worsens this tendency that the popular culture might have to reject the scientific experts in their claims. So speak to us about this moment and the urgency underlying your articulation of this book with the co-authors. I should mention Adam Frank and Marcelo Gleiser. You're trying to meet this challenge, and speak to us about just why you felt this book was so important to write right now.
Yeah, thanks. I would say that, well, we begin the book by actually invoking the idea of crisis. And we do that with a reference back to the German philosopher, phenomenologist, Edmund Husserl, who just before the beginning of the Second World War wrote a book called The Crisis of European Sciences. And the crisis, as he understood it, was a crisis of meaning, that science had arisen as a very, very powerful method of knowledge acquisition, and also of world transformation embodied in technology, most tangibly. But the meaning, the worldview, you could say the metaphysics that had come to be attached to science, was a confused and mistaken one. And it, to simplify, it was an objectivist, materialist ontology or metaphysics that had come to be attached to the practice of science as a means of gaining knowledge. So we say early in the book, we say Husserl's crisis is still our crisis, that this crisis has not gone away. If anything, it's intensified in all of the domains of science that we cover in the book. We cover biology and quantum physics and cosmology and cognitive science and earth system science, planetary science. And in all of the areas that we talk about, what's at stake is, on the one hand, defending the importance of the practice of science as a human practice that's rooted in human experience. That's one of the fundamental messages of the book, is that science is a very refined and elaborated and rigorous and distilled form of human experience. But the blind spot is when we forget its source in human experience and we substitute a metaphysics that makes experience secondary or derivative. And this happens in all sorts of different ways that we chart through the book. So that was actually what Husserl was calling attention to, was that he called it the surreptitious substitution. It was the substitution, the sort of covert replacement of a method with a metaphysics that actually doesn't follow strictly from the method at all. It's a metaphysics that arose for other historical and philosophical reasons, a materialist, reductionist, objectivist metaphysics that's tied to the rise of modernity and resource extraction and capitalism. All these things are completely bound up with each other. So he called that the surreptitious substitution. The German word is actually really the displacement of the concrete, lived, experiential immediacy of our embodied relationship to nature, which science always presupposes and rests on. The displacement of that in favor of a metaphysics of nature that sees nature as the abstractions that are used as a tool to get at certain aspects of nature. So the displacement of the surreptitious substitution is the substitution of that method of abstraction, idealization, mathematization for the concrete reality of nature embodiment and so on. And that's very much, I think, still with us as a crisis of meaning, really. It's a crisis of meaning. And that means that what one has to do is find a way to defend the importance of science, but not confuse the optional metaphysics that has become grafted onto it with science, and sort of extract the one from the other. And that's really the task of the book. Yeah.
Right. So I hope that we can, as the arc of this conversation unfolds, come back to the question of alternative metaphysical schemes to replace materialism. But in addition to Edmund Husserl, another early 20th century philosopher, everyone knows who I'm about to mention, that is a kind of hero in this book, Alfred North Whitehead, articulated what he called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is quite similar to surreptitious substitution, remarkably so, actually. That these two thinkers seemingly they had some shared students, but I don't think they really knew of each other's work as it was developing, but arrive and converge at some of these same insights about the direction science was going. And you write in detail and really elucidate Whitehead's critique of what he called the bifurcation of nature, where a methodology developed by Galileo and early scientists in the 17th century got reified into a metaphysics, where, as Whitehead puts it, science was considering nature as though it were split into hidden causes that would be behind our perceptual experience, and the job of scientists is to go about modeling that causal structure and kind of explaining away our experience, or all of our experience becomes just a kind of subjective illusion, or at least a kind of epiphenomenon. And so what I'm curious about from your point of view is whether you agree with Whitehead's attempt to get us out of that situation, where he basically redefines nature as everything we are aware of in perception. Right? And he says we can't pick and choose what's in the mind, what's out of the mind.
Right.
The perceptual field is what science is studying. Would you say that that's a fair place to begin correcting this slippage from methodology to metaphysics?
Yeah, I think so. I think both Husserl and Whitehead share that idea. And it's interesting, as far as I know, they didn't read each other. They must have known of each other, and they did have students in common.
Yeah, Winthrop Bell came to Harvard after studying with Husserl in the early 20s.
Yeah, exactly. And there were some other common students as well. But as far as I know, they never referred to each other. I mean, maybe they read each other, but they never referred to each other. They're both mathematicians originally, who become philosophers, but they're not trained to be philosophers. They come into philosophy from mathematics, and Whitehead in particular from really mathematical physics. And they both share the idea that the way that Husserl put it was we need to go back to the things themselves, but what he meant by that was the concrete immediacy of the world as we experience it. And Whitehead's way of putting this in the concept of nature is to say nature is that which is given in sense awareness. That's where we start from. So Whitehead is in terms of the history of philosophy, Whitehead is kind of writing out of the tradition of British empiricism when he says a statement like that, like from an Anglo-philosophical perspective with figures like Locke and Berkeley and Hume, the idea that sense experience would have primacy. That would be a very familiar idea. Husserl is coming out of a different tradition, but is insisting that perception, or sometimes Husserl uses the word intuition, by which he means just experience not confined just to perception, but including also imagination, memory, lived experience. That is the touchstone, and that's where one has to start, and that's where one also has to, in a way, thread back to when one's doing science or doing philosophy. Whitehead, of course, like in the concept of nature, Whitehead explicitly says, I'm not going to talk about mind in the sense of the knower or the perceiver. I'm going to talk about what is perceived, what is given in sense awareness, but I'm going to leave the perceiver out of the story. I mean, the perceiver creeps in various places, so it's not maybe entirely true that he just leaves it out, but that's what he says he's going to do. And then eventually that raises the question, okay, but you can't do that forever. You have to bring the perceiver or the knower or mind into an integrated story. And of course, that's what he does in his, starts to do in Science in the Modern World, and then does, in Process and Reality. So we don't go into that middle to later Whitehead in the book. We really keep the discussion pretty much confined to Whitehead's concept of nature, where he talks about the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is the idea that you take the mathematical abstractions and idealizations of science and you treat them as if they were concretely real, rather than as abstract, ideal tools that require people to build models and to have ideas. And he says that it's a fallacy to substitute the abstraction for the concrete reality as if it were the concrete. And that's really the same thing as the surreptitious substitution. Exactly.
So I think it would be really helpful to go into a specific example of how this happens.
Yeah.
And you discuss at least two I can think of in the book. You talk about color, which we can interpret perceptually, or in terms of wavelengths of light as measured by physicists. But you also talk about warmth.
Yeah.
You draw on the work of philosopher of science Hasek Chang, his book Inventing Temperature.
Right.
And so you describe in great detail how warmth, this qualitative feeling of heat, became mathematized,
Right.
and became the laws of thermodynamics.
Right.
Can you
Yeah,
go in
give
a little
that
bit to
story.
how that
Yeah.
happened?
Right, so in the book we call this the parable of temperature. And it's an illustration we use running throughout the book. So the idea is that, today we ordinarily think of temperature as, well, it's, if we're in Canada, we would use, Celsius or centigrade, but here in the United States, you use Fahrenheit. So we think, how warm is it? Well, it's 20 degrees Celsius, or it's, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. And we think that kind of quantitative statement is what the temperature objectively is. So to think that way, to think in terms of scales and measurements and thermometers, that actually took a huge scientific and technological effort over many centuries. And it started with people dealing with their concrete sensations of hot and cold. Say, how water feels to the hand when you immerse it. So people notice that, it might feel hot to me or warm to me, but it might feel cool to you. So there's variation in individual sensations. But we also notice that, we can agree on certain things that are more invariant. We can discover that in certain circumstances, water will freeze. In other circumstances, it will boil, but that's context dependent, whether you're at sea level, whether you're high up in the mountains. So we notice there are certain fixed points and certain variations. And we start to build devices in which we can control these variations. And in doing this, using fixed points, we create scales and thermometers, and we start to think of, well, the sensation of hot and cold is sort of an individual variable thing, but these fixed points, they're invariant, and we can use them to construct these more abstract measuring conceptions of what we come to call temperature. So thermometry is the science of quantifying temperature and building thermometers. And we also have to build special, what Robert Kreis calls the scientific workshop. We have to build special places where we can control the environment to make these fixed points more reliable. So we start to build this scientific infrastructure. We start to think in terms of more abstract models and idealizations, and we have particular tools for doing this. Then as physics develops, we get advances like the science of thermodynamics, which starts to conceive of heat and energy and work in particular ways, and then that gets underwritten by statistical mechanics, where eventually we arrive at the idea that, well, what temperature really is the average kinetic energy of the motion of particles, like atoms and molecules. And then we have an image of nature as consisting of particles that we characterize statistically and mechanically. So all that's fine. That's fantastic. That's an incredible advance in our knowledge. But the blind spot comes when we say, oh, and that's what's real, more fundamentally real than the sensations of hot and cold. And that exhibits what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature. Because what you've done is you made a cut in nature between what's objective and real, which is what's mathematizable, and what's subjective and in the mind, which are the sensations. So you've introduced a cut when the sensations belong as much to nature, right? We're natural beings, we have bodies, we live in the world. Our sensations of hot and cold are just as much part of nature. So Whitehead says, if nature is that which is given in sense awareness, you can't really pick and choose. That's part of nature too. But what happens is we get this bifurcation, And this is very explicit in Galileo, because Galileo, who's in a way the sort of founding architect of this, Galileo says, I'm going to think of nature as it would be if all the sentient creatures were removed. So he says, what if there were no sentient creatures? What would nature be? And for Galileo, it would be matter in motion described with geometry. But that creates a problem because the sentient creatures are part of nature, so you're going to have to account for them eventually. So then the question becomes, well, how do you put them back into nature as part of nature? Given that the very method you've created was based on excising them, if you then turn around and try to use that method to characterize them, it doesn't make sense. And that's the bifurcation of nature. And that's the surreptitious substitution and the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They're all sort of interwoven. And we describe this really fundamentally in terms of an amnesia of experience. The blind spot is an amnesia of experience. It's a forgetting that you couldn't have done any of this scientific work if you hadn't trusted and relied on experience. So if you demote experience, you're cutting out the ground on which science stands. And then that creates a huge problem. That creates a crisis of meaning. Yeah.
And you're black boxing all the messiness of actually trying to get accurate measurements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hasek Chang in his book Inventing Temperature will talk about, he actually wanted to measure the boiling point of water himself because he was reading all this old science, and they're like, well, it's never exactly 100 Celsius. It kind of depends.
That's right.
Is it a glass beaker? Is it a metal beaker? How deep into the water is the thermometer? What kind of thermometer? So it's really messy.
Yeah.
And if you black box all of that and treat scientific knowledge just in terms of the product that comes out the other side of that box,
right.
And you take it outside the laboratory, often that messiness comes back. And
Absolutely.
that can lead to skepticism from people who are not experts and they're wondering what the heck's going on. I thought you said water boils at 100 degrees Celsius.
Right.
So we have to open up the hood on science in a way, and I think that example of temperature is really helpful. Question for you here would be, would your position be to say, of course we learn a lot about the nature of heat from all of this scientific experimentation and modeling and thermodynamics, but when it comes to, if we are going to ask the question, what is the true nature of heat, of warmth, would you say that we have just as much to learn from our own embodied phenomenological sensation of heat as we do from what the objective sciences can tell us?
In a sense, yes. I mean, it's going to depend on what our questions are and what our interests are, but the experience is the ultimate reference point in a way, because even if you say something like, temperature is, mean molecular kinetic energy, that's understandable if you know some physics, but even those statements really do eventually, for their intelligibility, lead back into the sensations themselves. And those can be explored on their own terms using different kinds of methods, though. So you're not going to use an objectifying, quantifying method to investigate those, because if you really want to investigate them, they're individual, they're particular, they're context dependent, they're variable, and so you need an experiential method or a phenomenological method to investigate them.
To put a finer point on the question, maybe the issue of color would make it realize the importance of this. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, obviously,
Right.
Well, I mean, not so obvious. People know him as a poet. Our PCC students know him also as a scientist. And he actually thought his color theory was one of the most important things that he did.
Yeah.
But it was all rooted in his own observation and his sensibility as an artist of how color in different contexts appears to the eye, and even the activity of the eye in bringing forth colors that a physicist would say aren't really there. And so if we switch from heat to color and ask the same question, can we learn something about the nature of reality from color experience that we can't learn from the physics of wavelengths?
Absolutely, because if we ask what is color, color is hues like red, green, yellow, blue, purple, orange. It's lightness, the way that that light is reflected off of surfaces, or the way light appears in media like the sky or the water. It's degrees of whiteness or grayness or blackness. So those are all phenomenal terms that characterize what color is. If you then try to switch into a vocabulary of light wavelengths or surface reflectances, the physical characteristics by which surfaces reflect light at different wavelengths, and you can talk about the world in that language, and that's very informative, but then you're not really talking about color anymore. You're talking in the language of physics and optics, but color is, Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, said color is where our brain and the universe meet. So it's inherently experiential and relational. This is why Whitehead is important, because he's a philosopher of relationality. So it's relational, phenomenal, and Goethe is exploring color at that level. And Newton doesn't say anything about color at that level. And, color theory as we see it in, Kandinsky or Bauhaus figures like Kandinsky and Klee, they all read Goethe, and they are thinking about color as a domain of you could say phenomena, or you could say appearance, but not in the sense of like mere appearance, rather appearance as something that is how the thing manifests or shows itself to you, given that you have a certain kind of body with certain kinds of sense organs, and color appears in that space. And there are different ways that it does for different kinds of living beings. I actually wrote one of my early books I wrote my dissertation on color, and it was published as a book called Color Vision. And one of the things I was really interested in was that different animal species perceive color in different ways. Fish and birds have more complex dimensionality for their color spaces. So a color space is when you represent color in terms of an axis like hue, with say red blue opposed, red green opposed, yellow blue opposed, and then you plot different colors in the space. If you wanted to do that for the colors that birds or fish can see, it wouldn't fit into a three-dimensional human color space. It would be a hyperspace, because they have color sensing abilities that are more complex than ours. So, we don't know what those colors look like to the bird or to the fish, but we nonetheless share color experience with them. So there's a sense in which our color experiences are incommensurable. We can't map one-to-one from one to the other, but we still share the world of color. This is a very beautiful example, I think, of how you can, be in one world while being in different worlds. Very Whiteheadian in a way. So none of that is open if you just look at the world in terms of electromagnetic radiation and frequency and wavelength and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the interest of time, I want to move on to the question of time.
Okay.
Goethe and Newton never met, obviously, but Goethe had quite a polemical relationship to Newton's work on color, and there was a similar meeting of brilliant minds in Paris in 1922. Albert Einstein and Henri Bergson were at a talk. Bergson was asked to comment on Einstein's new theory of relativity, and particularly on the question of the nature of time. And Bergson spoke, I think I can say obviously, because many of you are reading Bergson now or have read Bergson, about time as duration, lived time, as it were, phenomenological time. And then Einstein got up and said very few words, but basically reduced what Bergson had described as duration to psychological time, which is a kind of illusion. And here's the bifurcation again. What's real is what physicists can measure with clocks. And so time becomes a site of investigation in your book as really one of the more profound examples of the blind spot. So, and I don't think things have improved much in 100 years. There are still partisans of Einstein and partisans of Bergson, and they seem to me to mostly not understand each other.
Yeah.
Can you speak to what that disconnect is about?
Yeah. So we talk about this really interesting meeting that happened in 1922 between Bergson, Einstein, and Bergson was known for his his writings about time and duration and evolution. His book Creative Evolution had been wildly successful. Einstein, of course, was known for relativity theory and was an international, scientific celebrity. And they met in Paris, and Einstein. So Bergson said he came intending only to listen, and then the discussion kind of flagged, and Bergson was called upon to speak to the assembly, and so he rose and he gave a short summary of ideas that were in his book that was not yet published, called Duration and Simultaneity, which was devoted to his thinking about time as duration, which is time as flow, time as process, time. Bergson's famous idea is time is not space. When we think about time, we spatialize it, but time as duration with an ever renewing now is not something that can be properly measured, or whose depths can't really be plumbed when it's spatialized. So clocks spatialize time, sundials spatialize time, because they present time in terms of the movement of a hand, in relation to numbers on a circle, say. So Bergson stood up and said some things about how, from his perspective, Einstein wasn't being radical enough, because Einstein was defining time in terms of simultaneity, and simultaneity in terms of clock measurements. But Bergson says no clock reads itself. It has to be read in the now by a clock reader with a sense of duration. And this is going to differ for a microbe with a microbial clock versus a human who looks at their watch as the train comes into the station, which is Einstein's example. And he was not really contesting Einstein's theory at all as a theory of physics. He had great respect for that. But he was saying that underneath the theory, there was the lived experience of duration that was necessary for the theory to be intelligible, really. The idea is that a clock can tell you what time it is, but no one looks at a clock to know what time is. They already have an immediate experiential intimacy with time through their own lived experience. And Bergson was saying this is actually underneath your theory. So Einstein very famously dismissed this. He said there's clock time, and then there's psychological time, which is how people vary in their experience of whether something is, takes a long time, or whether it's, short. If you're really bored, something might seem to last a really long time. If you're really immersed and interested, it might seem, to pass very quickly. So Einstein said, well, that's psychological time. And then he famously said, there is no other time. There is no time of the philosopher, by which he meant there is no primal phenomenal duration. And we use this debate as a way of saying that these were kind of like ships passing each other in the night, that they didn't really connect and understand each other, and that's symptomatic of the blind spot, of this rift between science and experience. And the nature of time and the relationship of duration to clock time, or to time as understood in physics, it's still, if you're in philosophy, it's still a huge topic of debate. And in science, of course, there's still a conundrum or puzzle or mystery, because there is no privileged now in physics. Any moment could be the now, but we don't experience that. We experience the now as the ever-present sort of, well within which flow is occurring. So this is a deep problem. This is part of the logic of the blind spot, is to go through and say, there's this blind spot, and it manifests in the puzzles about time, the puzzles about the nature of matter in quantum mechanics, the puzzles about consciousness in the study of consciousness, the puzzles about life in biology. All of these have their own versions of the blind spot. So that's the time version of the blind spot. If you're interested in this, by the way, and you don't want to read the whole book, there's an article that was just published in the online magazine Aeon on Einstein and Bergson that I wrote. It was published like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it just gives you the story about Einstein and Bergson, how it exemplifies the blind spot. nice and short read rather than a long book.
Yeah, it's a great article. After you discuss time in this book, I mean, one of the other issues would be the irreversibility of time, which thermodynamics kind of registers, but quantum and relativity physics don't acknowledge that at all. And it's such a hardcore common sense feature of our lived experience.
Sure.
And it seems that unless time is a real feature and directional flow of time, the irreversible flow of time is a real feature of the universe, it's hard to understand evolution and life. And so it becomes an outstanding cosmological puzzle.
Right.
And I think that's a really fertile area for deeper inquiry and maybe some dissertation research. But let's talk about life. Autopoiesis obviously is this theory of self-production that comes out of Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela's work, and you were lucky enough to study with Francisco Varela in your teens, or even earlier than that, right?
I met him in my teens. I studied with him in my 20s, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so this idea of life as essentially a process of self-production, I think, is very important for differentiating the sorts of phenomena that physics and chemistry studies.
Right.
And you write in the book that life is a surprise from the perspective of physics and chemistry. Why is that?
So the idea there is that if you were to just look at the world through the lenses of physics and chemistry, you would not be able to pick out or individuate the beings or the systems that are the living beings, the ones that are constantly changing materially through metabolism and renewing their own form as say cells through constant energetic and material turnover. So they have a kind of individuality or individuation. They are, put it in a Whiteheadian way, they are processes of individuation that you can't really see if you're just looking at the world in terms of here's the physics and chemistry of macromolecules. So you need the concept and indeed the experience of being alive yourself, being a living being, in order to be able to recognize the systems that are the living ones. The German philosopher Hans Jonas said it, put it by saying that life can be known only by life. And his example was the disembodied mathematical intelligence, the mathematical God. Today you might say the disembodied AI system that just has the laws of physics and chemistry doesn't really have the means to recognize the beings that have this way of self-individuating, because it gets washed out in terms of just looking at the flux of molecules. So autopoiesis is the term that means self-making or self-producing, and the idea there is that the living being, say the individual cell, the individual bacterial cell, produces itself in the sense that it's made up of internal chemical reaction networks that produce their own molecular constituents that include the production of a membrane that makes possible the internal chemical reaction network that produces itself and the membrane. That all of that is kind of like an interlocked loop. And out of those interlocking processes emerges the individual living cell. So that's this idea of autopoiesis, of self-making or self-production, that's at the basis of all life as we know it, all cellular life.
And you've developed what you call the mind-life continuity thesis, so that as soon as you have self-producing living organisms, single cells, you have some form of cognition opportunity.
Yeah.
Would you say you also have experience?
So the words that I like to use there are sense-making. Living is sense-making, or being alive is sense-making, and that's true already for the simplest, so-called simplest, they're actually not that simple, but the so-called simplest living organisms that we know on Earth, which are the bacteria. So bacteria, they make environments and they make sense of the world in the sense that they swim in oriented, directed ways in relationship to all sorts of different kinds of chemicals, some that they can metabolize as food, others that are noxious and threatening. And those chemicals, heavy metals or sucrose, again, if you just look at them as physical molecules, they don't have any special significance. They're just, they have various kinds of molecular shapes. But for the bacterium, they have significance as food or as threat or as something that energizes the cell or depletes it. So that kind of sense or significance, and I like the word sense because in French, the word sens means not just significance, but also directionality, like the sense of a river, the direction of a river. So the bacteria makes sense in the sense that it makes significance and it lays down paths. It makes the world have these directional orientations and vectors. So living is sense-making, or living is sense-making in precarious conditions, because there's always a challenge to life. Life is not easy. Life is always challenged in one way or another, and life is about grappling with the challenges. So living is sense-making in precarious conditions. So then if you ask, well, what about experience? The way that I am inclined to think is that with living as sense-making, you already have sentience. Experience is a word that we might want to talk more about what we mean by it exactly. But sentience in the sense that it seems to me reasonable to assume that all life involves the feeling of being living, the feeling of being alive. That's basic to the living being as having to struggle in precarious conditions, as having drives and motivations and orientations. It seems to me that is very difficult to conceive or imagine as not animated from within by a feeling of being. So I would use sentience to mean this feeling of being or feeling of being alive.
I think it's Hans Jonas's word, concern, that there's a horizon of concern.
Right.
As soon as you have an autopoietic cell. Would you say there's agency?
Yes. I would say that the difference between, say, a tornado or a hurricane and a cell, or a tornado, a hurricane, a wildfire, and a cell, is that the hurricane tornado doesn't really have agency. That is, it doesn't seek to alter its conditions in order to keep itself going. And all life does that. So agency in that sense.
So living organisms are not just gradient dissipators.
Right.
They have goals.
Yeah.
Do you think that the agency of even the simplest living things represents a kind of ontological rift in the structure of the physical world, at least if we understand the physical world as blind spot scientists tend to? In that case, it certainly does. But I guess
in the blind spot case, if you look at the world through the lenses of the blind spot, it's sort of a mixed metaphor. But if your view of the world is a blind spot view of the world, then life is a rift. Life is a surprise. Life is a problem. Yeah. But if you have a different kind of understanding of nature, then no, I don't think it's a rift or a rupture or a break. I think it's a qualitative transformation, but that is to say, life, nature is pattern formation, among other things, and elementary particles or hurricanes or tornadoes, depending on the scale at which you want to talk, participate in pattern formation, but the kind of pattern formation that happens with life is a kind of self-individuating pattern, and that is something distinctive. I don't think it implies a rupture or a rift, but it's something distinctive. It's a qualitative difference. Yeah.
Usually, when people think who have some training in biology and natural science, they really want to emphasize genes and genetic inheritance, and much of your work, and including in this book, you talk about how genes are actually a consequence of these organizational loops, these self-producing dynamics in a cell. The genes are a consequence of that, rather than the organization being determined by the genes.
Right.
right? And that has major implications for how we understand how much natural selection, the theory of evolution by natural selection, can explain life. Do you think that there can be an explanation for life, or is it just this emergent phenomenon that we might not be able to understand? It's just contingent. There's no laws that would explain it to us.
Well, that depends on what we mean by explanation. So if explanation is the kind of explanation that is the canonical form of explanation in physics, then I would say, along with Stuart Kauffman, no, life depends on physics but is beyond physics. So this is the idea that in physics, classically, you explain the behavior of how the billiard balls move on the table with the equations of motion, and you set up a state space or phase space where you have the initial conditions, which are the positions of the balls, you have the boundary conditions, which is the surface of the table, and you have the various forces that are in play if someone strikes a ball and the balls impact each other. But in order to describe that, you have to basically set up the explanatory space in advance and say, okay, here are the initial conditions, here are the boundary conditions, and now we're going to look at how the balls behave. So you can do that for life in a very limited way, but ultimately you run up against what Stuart Kauffman says is the limitation of not being able to pre-state the phase space for life. And the idea here really is that life is constant change. It's constant change and transformation. Your cells are dividing, genes are turning on and off, the embryo is developing, new species are being formed over evolutionary time. So there's no way to pre-state what the phase space is. It's as if you had a billiard ball and you were trying to calculate the movement, the trajectories of the balls, while the table was constantly changing its shape, the balls were reproducing, they were changing in size and texture. It's like the method doesn't really work. So that means that life requires different kinds of explanation. It requires strongly path-dependent historical explanations. What life can do in any given moment depends on how it got there through a contingent history. And we don't really have a well-developed mathematics for that. There are people who are working on that, so it's not as if it couldn't be mathematically described, but it wouldn't be described in the law-determined or law-entailing way that you would have in classical physics, or not just classical physics, but physics as we know it.
So I'd like to transition in our last 10 or so minutes to talk about consciousness. And let me see if I can get there. I want to bring in AI as well. I think that's related. How we think about consciousness and cognition nowadays is, I think, very often people will immediately go to AI, or they'll use machine metaphors to understand what human cognition is. But the background here is the sort of default physicalist cosmology, where life and mind or consciousness really, not only are they surprising, they shouldn't really exist. They're kind of these strange intruders in an otherwise, they're outstanding mysteries in physics and cosmology for sure, but the attempts to find a theory of everything in physics don't even bother mentioning life and consciousness. And so the scientific understanding, again, in general, there are plenty of exceptions among scientists here, but the general understanding of consciousness is that it's produced by the brain, and that with more time to study and model the neural connections in the brain, eventually we will figure out how the trick is done. Now, this approach is quite convenient for the AI industry, who are increasingly trying to market their products to the general public under the assumption that these machines can think, these machines are intelligent. And I think a lot of that is some very interesting engineering, but there's also a PR campaign here. And so how we define consciousness is especially important in this context because it's as though the very significance of human life and the sorts of political and economic decisions. I mean, I wish political decisions are hard enough in a democracy, and we don't really have that much freedom in terms of economic decisions if we don't have much money, but we're moving in a direction where it seems like a particular blind spot understanding of consciousness is really driving us headlong into catastrophe. And one of the points you bring up in the book is that rather than these machines becoming more intelligent, what's actually happening is that we're degrading our life world to allow the machines to navigate more efficiently. And indeed, it seems like human interactions are increasingly being degraded to suit the capabilities of these machines. And so, yeah, talk about how consciousness is generally understood in the neurosciences and the cognitive sciences, and how we might find ways of resisting this attempt to collapse it into something that a machine learning algorithm can do.
Okay, there's a lot in there. Yeah, so I mean, there's sort of two things in there. There's AI and how we should understand and think about AI, at least as we know AI today. And there's consciousness as a problem for neuroscience. And neuroscience and AI certainly interact and intersect, but they're somewhat distinct areas, and we devote distinct chapters to these in the book. So with AI, for me, the issue isn't so much of consciousness or sentience. I think worries about AI consciousness and sentience are basically hype. I think that deep learning systems are incredibly powerful statistical prediction tools. And what they basically do with very, very fast, powerful, with the high degree of computing power and speed and many, many, many parameters in the model, they are surprisingly able to find correlations that predict well what we, in using them, expect. So, ChatGPT predicts the next most likely token in a way that very much matches our expectations. But ChatGPT knows nothing about words. It knows nothing about meaning. It doesn't know what it's doing. It's a statistical prediction model. It's a large language model, right? It's a statistical prediction tool. It's not an agent. It doesn't even have rudimentarily any of the features of a living system that makes its environment, that exhibits agency, that exhibits self-production.
Though again, that word is going to be hijacked. Agent is what is going to be put on the package when they sell these things.
Of course, but that's hype, because they aren't really agents.
Right.
I mean, to be very provocative about it, computers don't actually do anything. They don't even compute. We use them to do all sorts of things. But the meaning, the relevance, the semantics, all has to loop through us. The mapping for the relationship between the number crunching, if you want to put it that way, and the meaning has to go through us and our agency. So I think that's not even to talk about consciousness or sentience. That's just to talk about agency and sense making. Mm-hmm. So when people worry about, AI sentience or AI consciousness or AI welfare, I think that's a kind of, I don't like this way of putting it because I have a lot of respect for animism, but it's a kind of tech animism. It's a kind of, it's a kind of degraded animism. Pseudo-animism, yeah, because real animism is something else, again. So that's, we could have a whole evening discussion about that, but that's...
There are engineers on the Google campus writing papers saying that current or soon-to-be produced models feel pain.
Yeah, I think this is just either hype or deep confusion, and it needs to be called out, and there needs to be a kind of wake-up call that this, computers AlphaGo doesn't play Go. It plays Go only because it interacts in a space of Go playing with us. It doesn't know anything about Go. It doesn't know that anything it's doing is mappable onto the space of Go. It knows nothing about the history of Go as a game, the culture, the things at stake in playing Go. So there's a sense in which it's not doing what we project onto it as doing, or it's doing that only in the space of meaning that we have created. AI systems don't make up games, they play our games. So I think, I think there's just a lot of confusion that actually I think is quite problematic, because then we read it back into how we think about ourselves in the way that you were saying. So we have this loop where we have an impoverished, degraded conception of what mind and agency are, and then we build machines according to that specification, and then we read those back into ourselves and think, oh, well, that's what we really are. Yeah.
But I mean, the trajectory we're on right now, and this is already happening, teenagers and adults are forming relationships with AI bots, and there are dozens of apps that cater specifically to this.
Sure.
Teenagers are committing suicide because the bots hallucinate and actually encourage there's at least one case of a bot encouraging a teenager to commit suicide.
There are deep pathologies in digital culture. There are marvelous things about digital culture. I don't want to be entirely negative, but there are also really deep problematic things. And it's embedded also, of course, in a structure of highly intensive resource extraction.
Yeah.
The amount of energy it takes to run something like ChatGPT, say, is just, it's astronomical. And so it's a degrading of the lived world on an environmental scale as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
So let's switch gears and talk about consciousness in particular. You say in the book that consciousness is not just another natural phenomenon, that it is the condition for the possibility of phenomena appearing to us in the first place. Mm-hmm. And you describe it as having a horizontal structure in the sense that you can't get closer to its edge. Right. It's always receding. Right. And you're always at the center of that field of consciousness, say. And I know you've done a lot of work on sort of the contemplative neurosciences and, contribute to, and for many years have contributed to Mind and Life, the Mind and Life conference, looking at the intersection of Buddhism and the cognitive sciences. And there are certain types of meditative experiences that we could characterize as non-dual or consciousness without an object, where there's a profound and, to use William James's term, noetic sense of having contacted the real and being in total, unbroken, seamless connection with that real as a conscious being. And many spiritual practitioners are tempted to sort of ontologize that experience. And I think you're careful in the book to say that that's not necessarily the only interpretation of what's going on.
Right.
So when you say consciousness is horizontal, it's a condition for the possibility of science or anything else, but you're not going so far as that kind of a maybe transcendental ontology. Where do you hang out in that space? There's plenty of room in between that, from that affirmation of consciousness as the ground of reality and just the horizontal perspective, but show us around in that space.
Yeah, so we talk about this in the book in terms of what we call the strange loop, which is a term we borrow from Douglas Hofstadter, but use in a different way from the way that he does. And the strange loop is that consciousness has this horizontal structure where anything that you can think or observe or experience or measure as a scientist is something that's given from within experience that has the horizontal structure where if you move, the horizon just moves with you. So, if you think of the metaphor of the horizon is, well, what exactly is a horizon? Well, you might say it's the line out there where the Earth's surface just curves, beneath your view. But there really is no line out there. it's a structure of your perception. So, you might think, oh, the line out there where the Earth's surface, curves away from my view. Well, I'm going to go, find that line. But as you move, it just keeps moving with you. So it's a structure. It's a structure of phenomena, really. So consciousness is a little misleading here. We introduced all these ideas in the chapter on consciousness, but that might make you think, oh, it's in the head, or it's something that belongs to the individual, because we talk about consciousness that way sometimes. But it's really, you might say it's phenomenality or its presence with this structure of things that are apparent, things that are hidden, where that shifts as you move around, either mentally move or physically move. So the strange loop is that you can't ever really step outside that, but when you plumb the depths of experiencing it, it throws you back on the body, on embodiment. And there's this, and also in the case of our way of inhabiting presence as human beings, that we are interrelated to each other. So, I couldn't describe any of this in terms of how things seem to me, with pronouns like to me, if I hadn't learned language with the differentiation of, me and you. And so it's not solipsistic. You explore it in the most intimate, first personal givenness, and it will throw you back out in phenomenological terms, into the intersubjectivity, the relationality. So there's this like Mobius loop. So some thinkers or philosophers or spiritual teachers want to say, well, because you can have an immediate, let's say, intuitive immersion in presence with no subject-object structure, and it feels so profoundly primary that it must be the ontological ground of everything. So they in effect, at least according to my way of thinking, they sort of reify consciousness, they substantialize it, they make it the ultimate ground. But the problem with that is, one, it doesn't actually logically follow, because if you think that, then you think that those experiences enable you to actually know the generative source of consciousness. But the amazing thing about consciousness is that it has this looping thing where you can never pin down its generative source. So if you say, well, it's the generative source of everything, you've kind of collapsed the subtlety and complexity of it. So that's my objection to that kind of ontology of everything is ultimately consciousness. Yeah.
Great. Okay, one last question for you, and then we'll open it up. You've mentioned to me, and I hope I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, that you're working on another book with these authors that's going to, as I understand it, look more at, okay, now that we've critiqued the blind spot, what would an alternative cosmological picture look like?
Yeah.
And I wonder if you want to just share a little bit of a sneak peek about what you're thinking in terms of how to make the positive case for an alternative now that you've critiqued the blind spot.
Right. So this is not developed yet. That is, the three of us as authors would like to write a book that's basically, okay, so suppose you accept all this blind spot critique stuff, and then what? Like, what's the alternative? How, what would a different view of, really, what would a different vision of nature be, and what would a different vision of science be? That's the task. So we haven't worked all that out yet, but I can say that what's important is a vision of nature. So this will, I think, lead us to deal much more explicitly with later Whitehead, a vision of nature that is not a bifurcated nature and is a nature of process and complexity and relationality, where the investigator is included reflexively in the relationality and in the processes in a way that has to actually always be mindfully kept in view or kept track of. So that's, in very sort of abstract general terms, the sort of the task. And then, the way that I see it as a philosopher is there are various thinkers in the 20th century who in different ways in different domains tried to do this. Whitehead was certainly one. David Bohm in physics I would mention as another one. Merleau-Ponty in phenomenology. Francisco Varela, my mentor in biology and consciousness. All of these thinkers had this sense that this is what we need to work out. So that's the task. In terms of how the book is going to be laid out, one thing we have, I think, decided to do is that, so in the blind spot we have philosophical introduction, and then we go time, matter, cosmology, life, cognition, consciousness, and then the planet, Earth, and we end with Earth systems theory and its antecedents in the Gaia theory of Lovelock and Margulis and others. So we're going to reverse the order. So we're going to start with the planet and say, we're not on a planet, we're in a planet. Science happens here. Science depends on our embedding in the biosphere. And the planet really becomes kind of the starting point. And then we're going to work out from there and probably end actually with quantum physics and with matter. So we're going to retake everything in a reverse order.
Neat.
Yeah.
I like that.
That's the plan anyway, we'll see.
Thanks so much, Evan. This has
Thanks.
been a wonderful conversation for me, and hopefully you've all enjoyed it. But now you have a chance to ask your own questions. I'll stop hogging Evan. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
All right, Jake.
I'll get started while people think of their questions. Can I ask you guys to repeat the questions when we say
Sure.
it, just for the sake of people hearing? I love this conversation so much. It's really fascinating, and I kept hearing in the back of my mind, or remembering in the back of my mind, Wilfrid Sellers' distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image. And I wonder how, I was always dissatisfied with that, because essentially, on my understanding, Sellers says you have to start with the manifest image, and then through the extraordinary cultivation of human reason, you find your way to the scientific image, which you then realize is actually true, even though it makes the manifest image fictional.
Yeah.
So there's like a kind of tragedy to knowledge in Sellers' account, where we're always starting in this error, and then find our way through to this kind of tragic, essential bifurcation of the world, right? So I wonder how, in the face of those kind of critiques that see the blind spot and yet say it's inescapable, given our knowledge, how do you respond to someone like that? How do you press for a case of not rejecting the manifest image, but finding a way to re-include it in our best sciences and our best philosophies?
Yeah. Well, if you start with a distinction between the scientific image and the manifest image, you've already, in a way, made the bifurcation move. I mean, Sellers' distinction is subtle in certain ways, because there's ways in which the scientific image really only functions or works within the manifest image, so it's not as if they're entirely separate. But if you make the cut that way and you say there is what the world really is, and science is what tells us that, and then there's the world as it's manifest to us, with our particular norms and so forth, then you already have a bifurcation, and that's not really going to be something that's going to work, I think, to overcome the blind spot. I think that the task with the blind spot is to always keep in view the experiential touchstone of science, that science starts from lived experience, it threads back to lived experience, and lived experience should not be demoted or occluded. And it's easy to say that, but that becomes a constant effort, a constant practice, you could say. And it means we have to teach science differently from the ways that we standardly teach it. It means that we need a cultural richness that we're in danger of losing, where where science, the interconnection of science to art is brought out, the interconnection of science with, in terms of the history of scientific thinkers, the interconnection of science and spirituality, science and mysticism, that needs to be brought out. So that's a huge effort, but that's the task. Yeah.
Millie?
Well, one of the issues, I can see a trajectory in which we can change the scientific culture of our Western world. The problems I also see are this rise in religious fundamentalism and increasing reliance upon AI systems and computers for collective sense making, and so for someone who's very fundamentalist in their religious beliefs, or someone who's very disembodied and making sense through AI systems, I worry that coming back to lived experiences means very, very different things for different people.
Sure.
And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I was really talking about experience within the context of the kind of experience that is required for doing science. I wasn't talking about experience in a much larger, richer sense of different, histories and traditions and communities of experience. Just invoking experience, I don't think is a solution to anything. I think experience is something that one has to work with, and one has to have practices for working with. And different traditions approach that in different ways. And so also I think part of the effort is for there to be conversations and engagements across different traditions of working with experience, whether they're contemplative traditions or indigenous traditions or the scientific tradition. That's a larger effort that I think needs to happen to enrich what experience really means in the context that we're talking about with science.
And possibly to, because what science is a very powerful tool for doing is to help many, we have this global community that can collectively sense make because we're all adhering to this way of seeing. But there's this increasing distrust of it because of the black box issue you were speaking to, and so it's hard not to sometimes visualize a world in which we actually all fragment in our sense making, and maybe that also needs to happen, and we lose a collective global method of sense making.
Yeah, I think, I wouldn't want there to be one collective global form of sense making.
Well, just for
I think I think it's important that there be, it's like an ecosystem, in an ecosystem you need many different kinds of species for it to be healthy, you need biodiversity. So I think it's the same in culture, you need different communities, you need different ways of sense making for the health of the human.
I think just in both of these questions, I feel like going back to what you started our conversation saying is that this is really a crisis of meaning. And I think about the purpose of this speaker series, Theōros, is to bring an enriched and to renew the humanities, and to see on some level what we do in natural science as an expression of a human capacity.
Right.
And an extension of our human forms of sensation, our human forms of cognition, and that we're always going to be knowing in some way or another a human universe. Not to get too anthropocentric about it, but that's the loop that you're describing. And whether it's religious fundamentalists or those who are beginning to worship large language models, a different kind of religious fundamentalism, perhaps. It seems like there's a disconnect and a lack of meaning grounded in experience being expressed there, and part of the blind spot is having a concept of truth that would be truth as something independent of the human, that's out there, external, objective, and science is how we get to it. Instead of a view of truth as something more participatory, something that we enact together, tentatively, but that still guides us. And I feel like we've held up this ideal form of truth, this very abstract form of truth that we will just be able to arrive at the objective definition of it. We have the equation, and that's impossible. Like we can't live up to that expectation, and we need a more down-to-earth form of truth, perhaps, to guide our collective sense-making. And it's the humanities that I think would help us do that. We can't just turn to science to give science a monopoly on truth, because it's not equipped to provide it.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. Yeah. I mean, the task of the humanities is to be concerned with meaning, and scientists can be humanists too. Scientists can be concerned with meaning. They are concerned with meaning, but the discourse of science that is the blind spot discourse of science is not sensitive to that.
Yeah. Carol.
Thank you. Thank you both. This was just so delightful. Working on my dissertation, this is like everything happening in my head while working on my dissertation. So thank you. And thank you for your question. I want to see if we can connect it. I feel like I'd love to just spend hours talking with you. Thank you for the sense-making issue about life, especially with the French definition of sense of direction. Thank you for mentioning that life has a feeling to it. My sense of calling as a philosopher only happened 5 years into the program, embodying phenomenology, so thank you for the embodied part. More specifically for me, embodying sacramental phenomenology. So I have a couple questions and a suggestion based on your question and your focus on Earth. Questions. Well, originally I was going to ask, are rainbows real? Feel free to respond to that, especially along the meaning dimension. This little phrase popped into my head, and I've not yet looked up to see if it's already a Jungian term or not, but archetypal knowing. Your horizon, thank you for that. My term is liminal limits, that I think resonates with that. My second question is, have you at all worked with the writings of Evan Thompson, especially? Okay, because to me this is exactly what we're talking about, and a lot of the problem that I see with, I wouldn't use the word normal, because I've sensed myself as skating outside the norms of human culture so often in my life. But the normal scientific way of seeing things it's so left hemisphere, so I'm working with that. But if you will talk about that, I'll appreciate that. And there was another question somewhere in there, but thank you for starting with Earth, because if there's one global perspective, last fall I tried to get students interested in doing Earth revisioning conferences. Students are too busy. And the idea that's come to me is, Earth is, we're the arrogant humans. We think we're the smartest beings in the universe, but we're not. Earth is. And the global connection that I see as a ground is, how do we stop being arrogant humans and become Earthlings? And what does that mean? How does it feel? What does it look like? And what are our experiences of it? So anywhere you want to talk about all of that.
That's a lot.
Right.
Are rainbows real? Yes. What's that?
Can we get unicorns too, or?
Man, I'm not so
There's
sure
a
about
line.
unicorns,
There's
but
a
yeah,
line.
but right. Yeah, I mean, rainbows are relational patterns, I would say, and they exist in a space of relationality, which is the perceiver and the perceived. So the statement that a rainbow is an illusion because really it's just a bunch of water droplets, I think is not a very good way to look at it, because it is a bunch of water droplets if you want to look at it through the lens of physics and optics, but the perceptual appearance is a stable pattern that involves the perceiver as a necessary, participant and element. And illusion is not the word I would use to talk about that. I would say it's an appearance, but not all appearances are mere appearances. They're phenomena in the original Greek sense. Phenomena is something that shows itself, that appears. So that's how I think about rainbows. Ian McGilchrist, so that's actually funny because I was supposed to participate here in the meeting on his work. Was it last March, I guess?
Yeah.
And
we missed you.
Yeah, for various reasons I wasn't able to get away from home at that point and had to cancel my participation. So I'm trying to think of a very, very short way of saying something about his work. So I admire his work a lot. I think he's very much concerned with all the things that we're talking about tonight. He's concerned with the meaning crisis and with how that relates to different modes of attention, to simplify his story. I'm somewhat skeptical of his brain lateralization map for that. I think for reasons I won't go into here, but I think for some nitty-gritty reasons in neuroscience and brain science that the lateralization story is not, I don't find it really supported by the evidence. So I don't want to, deny that he marshals a lot of evidence, and he's presenting a much more sophisticated version of brain lateralization than say what was presented earlier. But I'm still not convinced that that's actually the right way to look at things. I agree there are these different modes of attention, and those are important. So I agree with him on that at the psychological level. But I don't like the story, or I don't like all of the story of how he maps it onto brain structures and brain processes. So that would be my response to.
And how do you relate that to the scientific
One more.
I think the blind spot is that we are excessively preoccupied and fastened onto a particular mode of attention that, if I'm going to use it in his terms, talk in his terms, that downplays. So we valorize or give favor to a particular kind of selective, focused attention that screens out the background of experience that's necessary to select and focus in that way. But there is this other mode of attention that is the more spacious, more diffuse, open mode of attention that is always actually necessarily there, but that gets occluded when we fasten on to the more selective one. So I agree with him completely about that. I think that's actually a nice description.
I think we gotta move on because we have time for one more question. I want to make sure Ilse can chime in.
Hi, thank you for this conversation. It's great. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to formulate this as a question or if it's just going to be a comment.
Sure.
For me, the deeper blind spots is the socio-political, cultural conditions in which our current scientific paradigm
Yep.
seems to be. And you do mention it at the end, and recognize that. But for me, it should have been at the beginning because it's so fundamental that there's been the science and our epistemology as we have it now, exists because certain voices were excluded, and the feminine perspective, the embodied perspective, and the perspective from colonized peoples and indigenous peoples, and the embodied aspect of that and the experiential of that was so together that I feel like that it just should have been included, or because there's feminist authors, decolonial authors that have been writing about this for decades, and they keep being pushed to the cracks of academia on the very sides. And I think you have such a great audience and position with this book to include those voices and put them in the mainstream to, actually get to this deeper layer of the blind spot. So I really hope you do that in the second part.
Yeah, so just worth mentioning is that actually we refer to a number of them in the book itself. We talk about Carolyn Merchant's work on the suppression of the feminine and the way that nature gets feminized and then manipulated through Bacon's conception of the experimental method. So we mention her work and cite her work. And in the chapter on the planet, we talk about the problematic concept of the Anthropocene and how, from an indigenous studies perspective, that's actually it's a problematic term. So although, and we talk about feminist philosophers of science, we refer to them throughout the book. So we could, I think, talk about them more because their work is very rich, but we don't completely exclude them. We definitely refer to them along the way.
I know
Yeah.
you refer to them, but I just wish it would have been integrated more because you recognize the criticism on the Anthropocene, and just I think 2 pages after there's something like a sentence of we have caused this ecological crisis. No, because the criticism that you just gave on the Anthropocene and recognizes that we is very particular. It's within certain systems, certain.
Yeah, but I think the we there is meant to refer to the more restricted we, the we of the Western colonial industrial.
Yes.
That's what we refers to
Yeah,
there.
and I think that you know that, but I think that not all of the readers of this book will
Okay.
also read that. So I think it would have been, for the audience that you have, it would have been good to really specify that.
Yeah. Well, that'll be something for us to work on in the sequel book then. Yeah.
I know we have to wrap up now, but I know you have read Isabel Stenger's book, Thinking with Whitehead. She has a more recent book called Making Sense in Common. I don't know if you've read
I've
that
read that
one.
one too. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's an interesting case of a feminist philosopher of science who is also a witch and an animist and is able to inhabit. For her, she's a pluralist, so I don't know that I could say that that's one world for her, but she's able to swim in many worlds, let's say.
Yeah.
And I think Whitehead provides her a way of articulating
Right.
and justifying that
Right.
sort of an approach.
Yeah.
So a lot there to work with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I admire her work a lot. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Evan.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Thank you.